Okay, we'll get going here. So welcome to the session. Appreciate everyone taking the time to come out right before the party tonight. So maybe this will relax you a little bit. You'll have a lot of energy for the party. My name's Stephen Barron. I'm a program manager lead on the virtual machine manager team. I also have V. Raman with me. He's in the front row. We're going to switch about halfway through the presentation. He's going to take over the second half. It's not a great title for the session because we're going to cover a lot of the and more stuff, but these are what we consider to be pretty significant features in Virtual Machine Manager that we don't spend a lot of time on in other sessions. They seem to fit in with some other sessions here and there, but we decided this year to take this set of features and do a dedicated session to drill into a bunch of key features, again, that we don't really speak about in depth in our other sessions. Essentially what we're going to cover is template import export, which is brand new to VMM 2012 and did not exist in 2008 R2, library object equivalency, which also is brand new, integration with Ops Manager, which is not brand new but has been significantly reworked. We're going to go a little more in depth into dynamic optimization for those of you that are familiar with that. We used to have this feature called Pro. We still have a feature called Pro. One of the prime reasons for using Pro in the past was to get live migration in response to host utilization that was captured by Ops Manager. And what we did was we maintained our Pro functionality. We actually enhanced our Pro functionality in this release, but we chose to build a feature called dynamic optimization directly in Virtual Machine Manager that will automatically or manually, if you choose to not enable it in automatic mode, automatically balance your clusters by moving around virtual machines based on thresholds and aggressiveness settings that you define without relying on Ops Manager integration. Not because we don't think Ops Manager integration is important, but because we have all that information inside of Virtual Machine Manager already. And some of the limitations around Pro were we could move one machine at a time. But since we have all this information, we can actually construct what we call an action plan and orchestrate a series of moves to automatically balance your cluster. Power optimization works in conjunction with dynamic optimization, and this allows you to set schedules where we can automatically power off nodes that are unnecessary based on virtual machine workloads, and then automatically power them on either at the end of the schedule or in response to workload demand changes. And finally, custom placement rules. Really interesting feature that allows you some control over placement functionality in terms of where your virtual machines can land, where they should land, and where they must not land at all. So service template import exports, where we're going to start. In VMM 2008 R2, clearly we had VM templates, but VM templates were only database objects, and they still are only database objects. So if you're familiar with the library, you know that there are a lot of physical resources in the library, VHDs, application packages, PowerShell scripts. Templates show up in your library view, but again, they're only in the database. And this caused a problem on a couple different fronts. Number one was, if someone accidentally deleted a template, the only way to get it back was to restore the last known state of your VMM database. Of course, that was problematic because you would lose all the changes that occurred in between that last backup time. So people really wanted functionality to be able to export these out to a physical file system and back them up independently of the VMM database. Another great use of this is lots of people have two VMM servers in their environment, for example, pre-production and a production one. And maybe you're doing your template authoring, your building block creation and validation in your pre-production environment, and then you want to actually export those templates and import them into production as opposed to having to recreate them from scratch. So backup of template or template import export solves the backup problem, the restore problem, and VMM server synchronization in multi-VMM installations. We actually export templates and optionally physical resources bound to that template, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. So you could imagine if I created a service template in my pre-production environment that was bound to a large base VHD and had a couple smaller application packages, maybe I want to export the template along with the application packages, but I'll go ahead and rely on the fact that I have a VHD in my target system to which I'm going to import, and I can remap at import time to any physical resources and even logical resources like logical networks and run as accounts between environments. When we export, we give you the option to export sensitive settings in the template or not. Sensitive settings are things like passwords, product keys, and so forth. So again, you can choose to export those or not. And if you choose to export sensitive settings, you can choose to optionally encrypt the export file with a password. So we're going to switch right over into one of my systems, and I'll walk you through import-export, not in that order. So I have a number of service templates here, and import-export works for either VM templates or for service templates. I'm going to export a service template because my service templates generally have more artifacts in them than a VM template. So in my library view, I select any of my templates, and I choose Export. And over here, even though this is highlighted, over here this says Physical Resources None. So by default, we're not going to export any of the physical resources bound to the template. But if I click that None, I can now choose what do I want to export along with this template. So this is my VHD. I'm not going to export that because that's large, take a long period of time. This is a custom unattend file that I use, so I'll choose to export that, and I'll choose to export my blog engine application package. I won't export my server app vFramework because I know that I'm going to have that on the other side of my VMM the VMM server to which I'm going to round trip this export. So now it shows that I have some physical resources. I can export sensitive template settings or not. I'll choose to go ahead and do that. Since I've chosen to export sensitive template settings, I can also encrypt those settings, and I just give it a location to which I want the export to occur. So I'll create a new folder on my desktop called MMS Export. And I didn't select the MMS Export folder, so now I will. Click OK, and now we're going ahead and exporting not only the service template, but those two physical resources that I chose. And if I open that folder up, we'll see those artifacts start popping up here in a minute. And what we're doing behind the scenes is contacting the VMM library server, finding the application package and the unattend that I chose to export, and going ahead and getting ready to copy those out here. So we can see my application package is now starting to show up here. And then I'll have my unattend file, which will show up, and finally my service template export itself. That's the service template, and then I'll get the unattend file to show up here in just a second as well. If I switch over to my jobs view, you see we have, like other jobs, we've given you pretty good information about what we've done, and now I have this export sitting here waiting for me. And the unattend, along with the physical application package, my server app v package, and all the contents therein. Now, on the other side of the equation, I can come into my library, and I can choose to import a template. So once I'm in my library view, I have an import option. You'll notice I'm not going to do a demo of these, but I can also import and export individual physical resources if I want, irrespective of whether they're bound to a template or not. So on the import side, I can choose, again, to import sensitive settings or not. I'll leave that checked by default. And then I just browse to the path of my export. And this one we know was on the desktop in my MMS export. And I select the service template object, and it has the references to where the physical files are. I click Next. This is where we allow you the opportunity to remap resources. So I didn't choose to export a VHD with this package. We've found the VHD because I'm round tripping it to the same VMM server. But if I wanted to choose a different one, I just click the pencil icon here. I'm presented with the list of VHDs because we know this is a VHD object. And I can go ahead and say, I actually want to use this VHD for the imported template. Same thing for any application packages, any other resources of the template. If I decide, this unattend file was good for that environment, but it's not good for my new environment, I can just remove it during the import as well. So I remove the mapping, and then I'm told that the reference in the template is going to be deleted unless you, go ahead and remap it. I can also remap logical networks. So maybe in my pre-production environment, this Redmond network is valid, but in my production environment, the equivalent network is actually called Corp. So I can remap a logical network. And the same thing for run as accounts. Maybe my domain run as account in my pre-prod environment is different. I could choose a different run as account at import time. Like everything else in VMM, this is all automated. I do not want to overwrite my template, so I'm going to call this MMS import for the release. Like all of our other VMM functionality, there's a view script button here. So if you wanted to write a PowerShell script that ran every night to export templates as a backup mechanism, you could certainly do that. You could even write a PowerShell script that would automatically synchronize, say, your pre-production environment to your production in terms of templates by exporting from pre-prod and then immediately importing into prod, for example. So my import has completed, and you see I have my blog engine MMS import. And if I open that up in the Service Designer real quickly, what you'll notice is, remember I remapped a couple artifacts, the VHD, and more importantly, the logical network. So once this loads, I'll zoom in, and you'll see that when I exported, it was pointing to the Redmond logical network, and at import, I specified Corp, so we have actually gone ahead and fixed up the template. And we do that for anything else that you remapped. I'm going to switch back to my deck. That is template import export. The other thing I failed to mention at the beginning is I'm happy to take questions as we're going. So if anyone has a question, please do feel free to ask. If it turns out that there's too many questions as I'm going, I may ask you to hold to the end. But for now, if there's any questions, just raise your hand. Libraries. Yes, we still have libraries in VMM 2012. We've added a few new features to them. One of the big ones is called library equivalency. And before we get to that, I'll just recap what goes into the VMM library in the first place. One, there's file-based resources, again, VHDs, ISOs, PowerShell scripts, new in 2012 application packages like Server App V, Web Deploy, and SQL Data Tier applications, and also those non-file-based ones, your templates, and even profiles like capability profiles, guest OS profiles. They all show up in the library view, but that second subset, profiles and templates, are actually database-only objects. Another feature is you can actually associate a library server to a host group. And if you do that, it's not just cosmetic. We actually take that association into account. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide when we talk about using library resources and library equivalency. Lots of people wind up managing multiple locations with VMM. And you can imagine a scenario where I actually have a VMM server, I have New York infrastructure and Seattle infrastructure. And I have a single template, say a service template, and my users are deploying instances of that service into both of those environments. Maybe my pre-prod is in New York and my prod is in Seattle, vice versa, what have you. What I can do is I can actually stage multiple copies of the physical resources in each of those library servers. So I could have a copy of the VHD that the service template references in each location, a copy of the application packages in each location. If I didn't have that functionality, what would happen is I would go ahead and my service template may have a resource dependency on something in New York. Maybe the VHD is in my New York library server. I go ahead and deploy to my New York branch, right, my New York-based cloud. Great, the resource is there, file transfer is very fast. What happens when I take that service template, though, and deploy it into a cloud that's backed by Seattle Fabric? If we have to pull that VHD across that network, it's going to be super slow. So what we have are library object equivalency tags in VMM 2012. What we've added to all of our library objects are two fields called family and release. And you can think of them like family could be for a set of VHDs. Maybe my family is Windows Server 2008 R2, and my release is 1.0. And maybe later, I create a new copy of that VHD, and I give it the same family name, Windows Server 2008 R2, and I give it a new release. Maybe it's SP1, or I call it 2.0. We tag equivalent objects as being the same family and release. And there is a use for different releases. I covered that in a session this morning, and it's really around service template updates. So I'd encourage you to go back and watch that session if you want to understand how we handle different release objects in the service template case. But generally, we match family and release, and that tells us that a library object is equivalent. It's all manual, and what I mean by that is the admin, the person who owns the library object, is responsible for populating those tags with the right values. They're simply string values. Why would you use it? Well, one is the previous slide. Two is high availability and redundancy of resources. So even if you have just a single site that you're managing, you likely have multiple library servers. And if you stage copies of your physical resources on each of those library servers and tag them as equivalent, if we can't find the one that the template was originally pointing to, we'll go ahead and pick a different one. You can also combine this by by making associations between library servers and host groups. And that's how we'll find the quote-unquote closest available resource. So we're not doing any network analysis to find out that this library server is closer, but if you create the association, and I'll show you where you do that, we'll essentially walk the host group tree up and see if we can find, based on where your service is being deployed or your VMs being deployed, where is that closest resource in terms of associated library servers. So I'm going to switch back over to my VMM system. And in my library view, the first thing I'll point out, I'm not going to go into this view yet, but I will in a second, is we have a new section here for equivalent objects. So once you've gone through and tagged objects as being equivalent, you can go to the equivalent objects view, which I will, and you'll see a nice tree view of here's objects in this family and release, and here's objects in this family and release. But if I go into my VHDs, for example, and pull this one up, I've added the family and release columns into my view. They're not there by default. And if I go to the properties of one of these, you can see that I've tagged the SQL VHDs as family SQL 2008 R2 and release 1.0. So any template I'm deploying that has a reference to these has access to use any of the same VHDs that have been given that family and release tag. In my equivalent objects view, you'll see that I actually have 2 releases of my SQL VHD. I only have 1 copy of my 2.0, but I have 5 copies of my 1.0 release. So when I'm deploying, if I've set up my library server associations, we'll try to find the closest VHD to use for deployment. And speaking of the associations, you can associate a library server with a host group, and you do that by going to the properties of the library server. So if I said, I know that this library server is really close to my, is in Seattle, for example, or is in my Seattle pre-production environment, I can go ahead, create the association, click OK. And what would happen is any VM or service that I was deploying to either that host group or to a cloud that's backed by that host group, we'll start walking up the host group tree, looking at library servers that have that association. If we don't find a library server at the pre-production association, we'll look at the next parent level. So we'd look for any library servers that are associated to Seattle and so forth until we get to the all hosts one, and then we're just going to pick a library server. By default, library servers are set to no host group association. So if you want to take advantage of the functionality where we'll walk that tree and try to identify the closest library server, you're going to have to go through and manually mark your library servers and associate them. So you'll also note that this is not just for VHDs. I have a web deploy custom resource framework, and I can tag those as equivalent. Essentially, any library object, I can go and tag family and release to indicate equivalency. They don't have to be called the same, they don't have to have the same name either. You can see this SQL 2.0 VHD has a completely different name. So we don't rely on naming convention. We simply rely on your input of family and release strings to identify equivalent objects. Any questions about library object equivalency? OK. Integration with Ops Manager. How many people used VMM 2008 R2? And how many people used Ops Manager in that time frame? And how many people integrated VMM with Ops Manager? How many people did it successfully? Congratulations. Not the easiest setup in the world. We call it integrated, not really integrated either, because you actually had to run a separate install on your Ops Manager RMS. We had a lot of feedback about our integration with Ops Manager, or lack thereof. So I don't have it on the slides, but I'll walk you through quickly what I think some of the big changes are that we made. Number one, it's fully integrated into the VMM UI. So you don't actually go to your RMS or go to a management server and run a separate install. We have a wizard built in to the VMM UI in the settings pane that will walk you through, I think it's 3 pages, so very easy to set up. Number two, we heard feedback that people, for some reason, didn't like installing the VMM admin console on every one of their management servers in OM, so we removed that restriction as well. You don't have to install a VMM admin console on any OM server, and that goes for servers that you're going to do pro on also. We still require an OM console on the VMM server, but that's the only console install you need. OM console on the VMM server, because we need access to certain SDK binaries, since that's how we communicate with Ops Manager. Third piece of feedback we heard was my RMS had to be in the exact same or two-way trust with my VMM server. That restriction is gone as well. You can have them in untrusted environments relative to one another. I think those are the big ones that we solved. So pretty good list. There's probably a few other ones in there. But those are the big ones that pop into my head. So why would you integrate? Hopefully, you understand the benefits of integration, but just to recap, one, you're going to get monitoring of your health and availability of your VMM managed objects, hosts, virtual machines, services. We have great diagram views. We had this one diagram view in 2008 R2 of your VMM infrastructure, but we've actually gone ahead and taken the next step. And when you deploy a service, those of you that are not familiar with services in VMM, these are new types of templates we offer that allow you to model distributed applications inside of VMM and actually do in-guest configuration like Windows role feature, application deployment, payload delivery, script execution. Typically, you will use those to deploy multi-tier applications and business services. You should totally use them also to deploy standalone single instance services when you want to do in-guest configuration like role feature. But when you deploy a service, especially a multi-tier service, we automatically create a read-only distributed application in OM. And we update that in response to VMM state changes. So if I do a scale-out operation and add a new machine into maybe my web tier, we're going to automatically, when we detect that state change, push that information into OM, so that OM diagram always has an accurate representation of the VMs that contribute to the health of that service. Before working at Microsoft, I worked at a large enterprise, and I know whenever we had trouble with an application, the first 30 minutes were spent getting 20 people into a room to diagram out just the machines that were involved in delivering that application. And inevitably, someone speaks up and says, oh, we removed that server 2 weeks ago. And someone else speaks up and says, yeah, we added another server to this farm a week ago. And it took you, forever and an expensive amount of man hours just to figure out what the app even looked like from a server perspective. With this integration, you'll always know the VMs that are contributing to that service. We have, of course, Pro, and we have expanded our Pro capabilities in VMM 2012. For those familiar with Pro, in 2008 R2, we had one type of Pro object. It was a Pro base class. We now give you Pro objects for cloud, service, computer tier, VM, host, and so forth. And we have some pretty rich reporting capabilities that are available by default, just by virtue of your doing the integration and having reporting available in Ops Manager. The prerequisites, just to run through them, I put this in here really just for your reference afterwards when you want to take a look at the deck. We have a prerequisite reference for a number of MPs. So IIS, that's because of our self-service website that we still have in VMM that's still available. It actually inherits from IIS, so that's why that requirement is there. I get asked about that a lot. And the SQL Core library, because we use it to get the VMM database object, so we have a dependency on that. I mentioned you need an Ops Manager console installed on your VMM server. One other change is we require an OM agent on all of your Hyper-V hosts that you're managing. And we didn't have that requirement before. Although it seems to make perfect sense, if you were using OM, why wouldn't you have an agent on your Hyper-V hosts? So we require that agent. We require an agent on the VMM server. Ideally, you would have those agents pushed out and in a healthy state prior to performing the integration, although the integration will go ahead and complete even if you don't have those requirements, but your connection is not going to be in a great state until you have those requirements met. And we still require agent proxy on the VMM server, and that's because the VMM server is discovering objects that are not contained or hosted by it. You need 2 accounts. They can be the same account if that fits your environment requirements, but this is how we got around the RMS and VMM have to be in a full 2-way trust. We had one account before for the integration, so that account had to be known to the Ops Manager RMS and to the VMM server. What we did in 2012 is we allow you the opportunity to give us 2 different accounts. The first account is the account that VMM is going to use to connect to Ops Manager. It has to be an OM administrator because we're using that account to push all of our discovery information over at periodic intervals and on demand based on state changes in VMM. And an account that OM is going to use to communicate back to VMM, and that account must be a VMM administrator. And that's because that account has to have rights to take remediation actions that you may be doing via Pro in other scenarios. So I switch back over to my system. I have my integration already configured. What I can do, if anyone's interested after the session, I can remove the connection and walk through the wizard, or if we have some time left over from Raman's time, I'll go ahead and do that just so you can see how easy it is. Trust me, it's 3 pages. It's very simple. The other thing that we did, in addition to building in a wizard, is we actually give you the connection status now, so you don't have to wonder if the connection is up and running. We also enabled maintenance mode integration with OM, and this is, VMM has a concept of maintenance mode for hosts. So if I'm going to evacuate a host to patch it, if I'm going to evacuate a host to do some hardware maintenance on it, I can put it into VMM maintenance mode. And that's a great feature. The downside of that feature was I would put my host in maintenance mode and then start getting a bunch of alerts in OM once I started actually doing my maintenance. And when Raman starts talking about power optimization, you could imagine if we didn't have maintenance mode integration in our OM connection, power optimization would be of a little less value because all your admins would be woken up at 3 a.m. when we start powering off hosts once you've configured that. So if you enable that maintenance mode integration, when you put something into maintenance mode in VMM, we'll automatically put it into maintenance mode in OM. Now the connection, the status update is one way. So if you put something into maintenance mode in OM, that will not be reflected back in VMM. If you take it out of maintenance mode in OM, that won't be reflected back in VMM. And the idea is you're putting something into VMM maintenance mode to do maintenance on it. And the theory is you're then going to take it out of VMM maintenance mode. So when you put something in VMM maintenance mode, we'll put it in OM maintenance mode, and we'll set the maintenance mode expiration for the largest accepted value, which I believe is 2 years or so. And then when you take it out of VMM maintenance mode, we'll automatically pull it out. You can enable Pro or not enable Pro, and you can also temporarily, for whatever reason, disable the connection to OM. If you have to do something that you think is going to be disruptive, you can disable it and then re-enable it right from here without having to fully undo the integration and fully redo the integration. The other nice thing we do is we actually show you the management packs that we installed directly from VMM. So if you need a quick version check to make sure you're at the right version, you can come in here and look. And the other thing that people had difficulty with was not only did we not give you a good sense of what the health of your connection was, we really didn't give you an easy way to test Pro outside of importing a Pro pack or writing one and trying to duplicate the conditions under which it might fire an alert. So we built a PowerShell commandlet called test.sc pro tip, and we also exposed the initiation of that commandlet here in the UI. So I can click test pro, and if I look at my VMM jobs view, once I come out of here, you'll see that we'll fire off a pro diagnostics tip, and this will take anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds to run, so I'm probably not going to sit here and wait for it. I'm going to move on to some other things, but I'll stay in my demo session, so we should see the pro tip actually pop up in VMM, and I'll open up my pro window. Actually, I will leave that hidden, and it should blink. We'll have some indication that that's coming in. So the next thing I wanted to do was switch over into my Ops Manager console and show you some of the new views that we created, as well as what a service diagram view looks like. So you'll see, I see this blinking. So I did get my test pro tip, and since it's a test pro tip, it's going to automatically resolve itself. And if I click it, it'll give me that information. It's a diagnostic alert. Simply will tell you that, yes, your pro connection is up and running, and it's healthy. The other thing that we gave you on that screen, and I'm just going to go back to VMM for 1 second here, is we made another commandlet called write SC Ops Manager connection, so write-SC Ops Manager connection, and that will force a full incremental discovery. So we'll re-push all the information that we have. Before, you could have done that by doing a set VMM server command, but it kind of wasn't well documented. So we not only built the new commandlet, we also gave you the functionality in the UI, where I can come to my OM settings here, click refresh, and that'll initiate a write-SC Ops Manager connection behind the scenes. So now in Ops Manager, we have a VMM, a Virtual Machine Manager folder. Underneath that, there's an Agents folder, a Managed Resources folder, and a Performance folder with a series of dashboard views. So the first thing I'll start with is the cloud health. So hopefully everyone knows that there's this new thing in VMM called private clouds. So we'll push over the health of those clouds. Health is determined by the remaining capacity of the cloud. So we include default monitors for the different quota dimensions on a cloud, like CPU, memory, number of virtual machines, the traditional quota points that we used to have. And by default, your cloud will go into a warning state if you've reached 80% of the capacity, and into a critical if it's 90. Those thresholds are overridable in OM via standard override mechanism. So if those thresholds don't meet your needs, feel free to override them in OM. We have host cluster health. I don't have a cluster in my environment here. We have our traditional host health view, where I'm going to get the state along with any active alerts that are particular to those hosts. Some of my hosts need a little bit of attention. We have IP address pools in VMM. Hopefully everyone knows that as well. We always push the IP pool objects over, but we don't have any default monitors. There's still value there, though, and the value is it's very easy using OM wizards to write a monitor or a rule by just walking through a set of simple wizards. It's not so easy to actually get objects and classes discovered in OM. So we did decide to push all of our objects over and make them available, and if you chose to write a monitor or rule to maybe warn you when your IP address pool had 10 remaining IPs in it or something, the object's there for you, and the monitor, again, is the more trivial portion of the equation. I have a library server view where, again, I'm going to get library server state and any alerts that are particular to those things. MAC address pool is the same thing as IP pool. We'll push them over, but we don't have any default monitors for them. And then service health I'll spend a little more time on. So again, services can be single tier, single instance, or multi-tier applications. I'm going to switch back to my VMM console real quick and show you a particular service that I have deployed, which is a pet shop application. It's a 3-tier application. It has a web front end, which is scalable. So you'll see my web tier actually has 2 VMs running in it right now. a mid-tier for business logic that has one VM running in it, and a SQL tier that also has one VM running, and that's, of course, providing the data for this application to function. Now, whenever you deploy a service, I mentioned earlier, we'll immediately initiate a snapshot discovery and push that information over about the service. And if I go ahead and find my pet shop service here, I can right-click it and choose to open up a diagram view. I think I already have it open. So by default, I'm going to get this nice diagram view of my service, which shows my service health, my tier health, and then for each of the individual tiers, I can also drill in and see the exact virtual machines that are in that tier. And again, this is what I was speaking about earlier. If you have a problem with this service, you don't have to get 20 people in a room to figure out the VMs that are contributing to it. It's right here. And if you make a change to the service, like do a scale-out operation or delete a VM, we're going to almost instantaneously initiate, again, that incremental discovery to push or remove that object from OM. And any state changes, if the VM goes into an unhealthy state from a hypervisor perspective, we immediately push that information over. For any of the VMs, one other thing I wanted to point out, if you have OM agents inside of your virtual machines, and if you're using Ops Manager 2012, the Ops Manager team gave us a new type of relationship that allows you to drill into the virtual machine object and actually get to the Windows computer object that's been discovered for that VM. And from there, I can drill into everything that Ops Manager knows about that machine. As you'll see, because I have an OM agent inside of that, I get the IIS role, I get the Windows computer information, I get everything in my diagram view. So if I'm troubleshooting this service, I can drill down from this diagram and get access to information about everything Ops Manager is aware of on and within that machine. The health roll-up, the relationship is for visualization purposes right now in Ops Manager. We're looking to extend that for health roll-up purposes as well in the future, so that if I had a problem with, say, the IIS web server role, it would roll up all the way to my service health. Today, though, diagramming and troubleshooting purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse this guy. The other nice thing, of course, is for all these VMs, I'm going to have access to a large number of properties about them directly from this diagram view. Same thing about my tiers. So I'm going to get things like what's the minimum count, what's the maximum count. The tier would be in a warning if I were above or below the minimum or maximum account, respectively. If I switch back to my OM console, storage pools, we will push over also. Another new concept in VMM 2012. These also have capacity monitors on them with default thresholds of 80 and 90%. And again, you can override those thresholds should they not suffice for your environment. Virtual machine health is just as it was in VMM 2008 R2 with OM integration, state and alerts, and same thing for the VMM server. And then we have a bunch of performance views for all of these objects. So for clouds, we're collecting performance metrics about the cloud, and what it is the aggregate CPU usage of the cloud, or the aggregate memory usage of the cloud. So for any particular cloud, like I know my production cloud has some stuff running in it, I can look at memory usage at a short-term interval in my OM console, and a longer-term interval via the data warehouse, because all of the performance metrics we collect, we also mark as DW metrics, which means they're going to get pushed into the OM data warehouse. And whatever your default grooming period is, I think the default is 13 months, you're going to have access to those metrics for that period of time. Same thing for host performance. We collect a series of metrics for hosts. We don't collect any performance metrics for IP address and MAC address pools, but again, the objects are there. So if you wanted to trend your IP pool usage in terms of IP addresses being checked out and reclaimed, you could, of course, write a timed PowerShell script rule to go ahead and collect that info from VMM and submit it to OM as performance data. And of course, we have virtual machine performance, which is going to have metrics about my virtual machine, CPU, memory, network traffic, disk space, and so forth. And we still maintain that VMM diagram view, which gives me an overall view of my VMM topology. And of course, in a large environment, this diagram view can become rather large. So I would imagine that lots of people will actually use different state views to get at a subset of their environment, like the host health state view to go ahead and drill into a diagram of a particular host or a particular cluster. But this diagram view is still there for folks that were used to using it. The other thing I wanted to show you was the set of reports that we ship by default. So when you integrate us with Ops Manager, if you have reporting enabled in Ops Manager, we go ahead and we push these reports into the OMDW, make them available. So we have a capacity utilization report, a basic chargeback report. The chargeback report will rely on you inputting values, dollar or cent, right, some type of monetary value for CPU, memory, and storage costs, and then selecting a set of objects, and we'll go ahead and run a report and generate it for you. The forecasting reports, if I switch back to my VMM server, you'll notice on my Ops Manager connection, and I don't have this configured in my environment, but we have this SQL Server Analysis tab. So I can do OM integration without specifying an analysis services server. If I have an analysis services server at my disposal, though, it needs to be running on the OM reporting server in this release, and I need to install the analysis services snap-in console on my VMM server. We don't actually push any data into the analysis services server, but we do push a stored procedure that we use for computational purposes. And the reports that rely on that are each of our forecasting reports. So host group, SAN usage forecasting relies on your analysis services configuration. So if you don't have that configured, those reports are never going to give you data. If you do have that analysis services server configured, what we do is when you run a report based on your parameters, we go ahead and pull the existing data we have, either for the host group in question or your SAN usage in question. We look at the historical data, we pump it through that stored procedure in the analysis services server, and it allows us to forecast what we think your usage is going to be 30, 60, 90 days from now. So those reports, again, rely on analysis services being available and configured within your VMM to OM integration. None of the other reports rely on that. So the other reports all function. I pre-opened a few reports just to give you a flavor of what some of them do. So if you have configured the cost center property on your virtual machines, you can run the virtual machine allocation report, and per cost center, it's going to give you total number of VMs, the ones that are deployed, how many are actually stored in the library, the aggregate usage of processors, memory, disks, and so forth. We also have, or I also have opened a virtual machine utilization report that I ran from January 1st of this year, and that's for each VM is going to give me the average CPU usage, max CPU usage, total RAM, average memory usage, and so forth, along with VHD size and some other information. And finally, I have a host utilization report, which is very similar to the VM one. I ran it again from the first of the year, and for each of my hosts, it's going to give me the most recent number of VMs running, but then it's going to give me historical information about average CPU usage, percent free disk space, average memory usage, and so forth. So hopefully everyone knows about these reports from the past. We've made some enhancements to them, added some new ones, and you get these for free just by integrating with OM, and you don't have to worry about configuring the data because we start pushing that data over immediately, and we push it over at frequent enough intervals that you're going to have a good amount of data here to do trending and analysis over time. So back in my OM console in the monitoring space, I think we've covered just about all of the views here, except for these two, again, just alerts and state of your VMM deployed agents. So I'm going to switch back to VMM. I'll just open up that Pro window, and my remediation failed for that, but that's OK. You saw it started. I think we covered just about everything about Pro. Any questions about the Ops Manager integration? Sure. So in the past, to do automated live migration of machines based on host utilization, like memory utilization or processor utilization, with VMM 2008 R2, we relied on Pro. Now, you could still use it in 2012 to do that. We don't ship those two MPs anymore. So you'll recall in 2008 R2, we actually shipped two Pro monitors, essentially, for host memory utilization and host CPU utilization. The challenges with Pro was, one, it took time between the time that the alert would be generated and the time that the remediation would run. Number two, it would only live migrate one machine at a time. So if I had, say, two machines on a particular host that were really causing that host to violate its CPU utilization threshold, your Pro tip would fire. Even if you had automatic remediation, we'd go and find the machine that was using the most CPU, right? And we'd move that machine, and we'd reset the monitor. But if you had two machines contributing into it, now you had to wait for the next cycle for the Pro tip to run, fire up again, and then we'd find the next machine and move it over. And it's even possible in certain situations that the machine using the most CPU may not even be the best machine to move, right? It's using the most CPU, but there may be other things to consider. So we went back when we were designing 2012 and said, we have all this information about host clusters. We know all the VMs that are there. We collect all the metrics because we're pushing that information into Ops Manager. We should write a feature that we wound up calling dynamic optimization that can automatically or manually, right? So you can run it by right-clicking a cluster and saying optimize hosts, or if you're comfortable with it over time, you can set it to run automatically at periodic frequencies. The default is 10 minutes, and we'll automatically balance the cluster. And we won't do it one machine at a time. We'll actually generate action plans that will move multiple machines. Raman's going to go into more depth about that. So.
Piece of information that you should also consider is the difference between dynamic optimization and pro. So DO is native to Virtual Machine Manager, right? But there are a lot of cases where you actually have third parties who are gathering information from their environments, either from the SAN or from the networking or from the networking environment, and they need to have some action taken in the context of Virtual Machine Manager. That still requires that requires pro, right? So dynamic optimization is only when you're talking about optimizing virtual machine placement in the context of the host that we manage. But if there are third-party information that you want to be able to do something in the context of VMM, then you need to go through Pro. Does that help?
Okay. I'm going to bring Raman up now, and he's going to take the rest of the session all about dynamic optimization, placement, power optimization, lots of other good stuff. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll try to keep up with the torrid pace Stephen said as he walked through these features, and hopefully it'll go a little faster because we talked about some of these features right towards the end. So two of the new features we added were dynamic optimization and power optimization. The dynamic optimization itself is there to essentially help you automatically or manually balance your VMs across a cluster. As you know, with live migrations, VMs are no longer bound to a single physical host, as during the life cycle of the VM, it's possible for the VM to move from one host to another. In fact, we expect it during maintenance modes and other things. But even between explicit movements by the user, there are times when the load on the machine would make it ideal for individual VMs to run on different hosts. And dynamic optimization is expected to help you do the scheduling on a continuous basis. It is a native feature to VMM, and it is in some sense a replacement to the host and CPU Pro monitors in 2008 as it stands. And as Stephen mentioned, DO coordinates moves of multiple machines at once. The next feature, power optimization, builds on top of dynamic optimization. It helps to balance your VMs such that you can essentially compress them into the fewest hosts possible, and you can turn off the hosts that are underutilized. The goal of this is to help you save power, and the easiest way to save power is to be able to turn off physical hosts. And of course, when physical hosts are turned off, you also want to be able to turn them back on when load is higher, and you need to be able to catch up with your workload as it stands. The other feature you can use is a user-defined schedule. So based on the schedule, you can also cause power optimization to be enabled so that you can turn the host back on as per the schedule. So just a reiteration, the way dynamic optimization and power optimization work, they are built off of the placement technology you all are familiar with. It is part of existing VMM products. The dynamic optimization itself uses the placement engine, but it builds intelligence on top of that, and it essentially helps you balance your load across a cluster. Power optimization is built on top of dynamic optimization, and it helps you essentially compress your workloads into the fewest nodes of the cluster and be able to turn off machines when they're not required and be able to turn them back on as you need them. So just a reiteration of how placement works. You have the notion of a host reserve. This is the amount of resources that the host itself needs in order to be able to function effectively. We make sure that during placement, we do not place any resources on the host that will violate the host reserve. You can, of course, manually override it if you want to, but this is the limit at which we will essentially run the load on the host itself. When you turn on dynamic optimization, there are a few settings, and I'll walk you through these settings in short order. Essentially, in addition to the placement reserve, you will be able to set the thresholds at which you want dynamic optimization to trigger, and you will also be able to set the aggressiveness with which you want dynamic optimization to work. The aggressiveness just determines how often you will move or how quickly you will trigger dynamic optimization, how quickly you will trigger the migration of VMs during dynamic optimization itself. So I'll quickly blaze through these screenshots because I'm going to walk you through the demo of these anyway in a minute. So as you can see, there are options to be able to set your dynamic optimization parameters. You can either inherit the settings from your parent host group because these are host group settings, or you can explicitly set them for the host group itself. In addition, you can set the thresholds for each of the dynamic optimization parameters. And finally, power optimization is its own button that you will have to enable. And I can walk you through the settings of the dynamic optimization itself. Here's an up close of all the thresholds: CPU, memory, disk, and network. And I'll walk you through each one of these. But really, just as an example, when you set the CPU to 30%, it means when the host is essentially starting to consume 70% of its CPU, we view it as a candidate to be dynamically optimized. So we would want to move some of the VMs off that host onto other hosts with the expectation that the host should run ideally below the 30% threshold. Same for memory, disk, and network I/O. The aggressiveness button, and I'll walk you through this one too, is really determines how aggressively we want to trigger migration of VMs. If it's very high, then we will trigger VM migration even for a small benefit in the performance of the overall host. If the aggressiveness is low, then we essentially wait for a lot more benefit before we trigger the migration. And just in terms of mapping it to the star ratings, if you have a highly aggressive DO schedule, even a 0.2 star improvement will cause a migration of a VM. If you have a low setting, then you will have to get an entire star rating difference before we trigger the migration of a VM. The default is medium, by the way. So let me walk you through. Here we go. So as I mentioned, DO is something that you specify at a per host group level. So when you go to a host group properties, you can head up here. You have the dynamic optimization button that's enabled on a per host group basis. If you inherit from the parent, all the settings will be turned off here. They'll be grayed out. But if you choose to explicitly specify it, you can go ahead and adjust the thresholds for DO as you want. I'm not going to enable that, but this is just to give you an idea of how and where it gets set as it stands. So in addition, if you wanted to enable power optimization, and when I talk about power optimization, I can go through that one, but the setting is right here. Cancel. You want to continue? Yes, there we go. That stands. So back to my demo, to my slide deck. There we go. Here we go. So just to walk you through a couple of examples of how dynamic optimization works, come on. There we go. So the dynamic optimization threshold is over and above your host optimization threshold. If you think about the host reserve as it stands, the host reserve is a hard limit. We will not place VMs on that host if it'll cause us to break the host reserves. Dynamic optimization is what we would like the host to run under. So essentially, if the load of the host is such that it goes above the dynamic optimization threshold, we will trigger dynamic optimization or the evaluation for migration of VMs at that particular time. If the dynamic optimization threshold is essentially, let me walk you through an example, it'll be quicker. So if you have a bunch of VMs on a host and we are above the dynamic optimization threshold, the next time DO runs, it will evaluate a better host placement for that VM. We will cause the VM to move as a consequence and help get your cluster balance as it stands. These would all be hosts within a single cluster for this to essentially work. So another example, and this example shows you a slightly different behavior in dynamic optimization. Even if your VMs are essentially such that you have load on multiple machines, And even if we believe that a dynamic optimization will cause you to go over the threshold, based on your aggressiveness rating, if there's a benefit to the overall cluster by triggering dynamic optimization, and a VM migration will overall cause the cluster to run better, we will essentially trigger it. So that dynamic optimization limit is what we would prefer the host to run under, but based on the current state of how the hosts are running, if we think there's a benefit by essentially causing dynamic optimization and a VM migration, we will do that. So on to power optimization. As I pointed out earlier, power optimization consists of two settings. You'll have to turn dynamic optimization to automatic, and by default, it's done every 10 minutes. In addition, you'll have to turn on power optimization, and I'll walk you through the settings that come with power optimization. Here is the details pane, and I'm going to blaze through this because you have a demo coming up right now. So back to the dynamic optimization menu. So the reason you need to turn DO on automatically in order to enable power optimization is every time we run dynamic optimization, we also evaluate whether or not we want to power on or power off machines. So this allows you to set limits for the power optimization, and typically these are higher than the thresholds that you set for dynamic optimization. And the goal here is to ensure that if the load on the machine is low enough such that migrating machines off a single host will allow you to power down the host, then we want that to happen. Correspondingly, if the load starts exceeding the power optimization threshold on the other hosts at some point in the future, you want to be able to turn machines on and migrate them back onto the hosts that have just been turned on. So in this dialog, you can not only set the thresholds as you want, you can also turn the schedule on. And you might choose not to. In this schedule, power optimization is on all the time. You can choose maybe during production hours, for example, you do not want to turn dynamic optimization off, in which case you can start clicking off the hours that you don't want dynamic optimization for as it stands. And again, this is completely configurable. So essentially this dialog, which eventually you will see the PowerShell script that essentially runs this particular part of the power optimization, but you can essentially configure all the features of the power optimization itself. So I'll cancel out of this one, and I'll walk you through a couple of examples of. There we go. Back to. So one power optimization example is, when you're off hours and essentially the load on your VMs is essentially going down. As I pointed out, your thresholds are much higher. But as your load decreases and your VMs essentially can be compressed onto fewer hosts, you can essentially run, the next time we run DO, it will essentially migrate the VMs off a single host and turn off the host that has no load on it. The thing to note here is that when we do a migration of VMs, we will only migrate it such that the target on which your VMs move do not exceed the power optimization threshold themselves. This is so that we don't have the ping-ponging of VMs, such that you move it to another host, it violates its power optimization threshold, and now you need to turn on another host and bring them back as it stands. The other example is the converse of this. So eventually you get back to peak hours, and the load on your VMs increases. It breaks the power optimization threshold. You need to turn another host on and essentially move a VM back onto the turned on host. One thing to remember is we still respect cluster overcommit and cluster reserves that we have specified, so we will not turn off machines with, unless we are able to sustain the cluster overcommit requirement. So I showed you most of the demo up front. So let me talk about a couple more features, and then we'll be done in short order. So custom placement rules. One of the challenges for us was placement itself is a way of finding the best host for your virtual machines. And while we can do a lot of monitoring of performance statistics and disk requirements and memory requirements and network connectivity and make sure that these things are met on the target host, the challenge is no matter how well we do placement, there will always be additional rules and additional sets of requirements that need to be taken care of, which we can't account for in our placement engine. So we try to provide extension points that will be hopefully useful in order to accommodate additional placement requirements. And I think this is easier to walk through with a demo, so I'll just walk you through the configuration for this, but essentially we use the custom properties available on VMs and hosts and templates to be able to allow a user to be able to specify how they want their VMs placed. And there are 4 rules that essentially help enforce this. For each of the custom properties that we want to be taken into account, you can either specify that they are a must-match custom property, or should match, or must not match, or should not match. And the must ones are all blocking as it stands. So here we go. So let me show you a few custom properties I've already set up here. Yeah. So on this host, for example, I've set up a couple of additional properties called operating environment and SLA. And these are just text strings, so you can enter whatever it is that you need out of this host. We have similarly set up, and this is in my production host group. In my pre-production host group, I can have a similar set of properties with completely different values. So you can have a pre-production environment which has the same custom properties, but with different values as it stands. In addition, when I go to my library view, and there's a VM template that I want to deploy, I go to the properties of the template. Just give me a second here. Here we go. I can again specify that this template should only be deployed to hosts that essentially match these particular values. And I'll show you how to set up the rules. So this template has a particular set of rules again, and it specifies that its operating environment is only for production, and its SLA is 5 nines. So now, what I can do, for example, I can go to my, so when I go, and I can specify this on any host group that I want specifically. So I can specify the way I will essentially cause matching of those custom properties to happen. So for the operating environment, I've specified a rule that says it must match the host. So in order for this template to be deployed on a host or be valid for that host, this property must match between the template and the corresponding host. The SLA is a should match. So ideally, we would like it to match, but we will not block deployment if it does not match as it stands. So now, if I go to my library view and try to deploy this, if I try to create a VM out of this, so let me specify. Here we go. I'm just going to next through all the defaults. Go. So now, as I watch placement running, eventually it's going to give me the rating for each of my hosts, and both in production and pre-production. As you can see, the specification of the template was production and 5 nines, and that matches each of my 3 hosts that are in my production host group. But if you look at my pre-production host group, it will tell you exactly why it failed to place it on that. And essentially it says the value for a custom property operating environment violates a property matching rule. And this one was not a hard enforcement, which says the SLAs was 5 nines and it did not match. So you can essentially enforce some level of extension through use of custom placement rules, yes, as it stands. So one last thing that I'm going to talk about, and hopefully after that there's still time for questions. So one last thing. So for those of you who have played around with 2012, we have really done a lot of work to try and separate out the user or the VM provisioner from the manager of the underlying fabric. So the self-service user and the fabric admin personas, we have caused a lot of delineation between them through the use of this artifact called the private cloud. We did this because they essentially cater to 2 different personas, and we want them to be separated from each other. The challenge, of course, is self-service users will run into trouble and will come up with issues, and you will need to essentially troubleshoot the issues on their behalf. One of the challenges of doing that is you do not want the self-service users to have information about the underlying fabric. And so you do need to facilitate the information exchange between the cloud users and the underlying cloud providers as it stands. So suppose, so I will walk you through an example of this, but in case, the specific example I will walk you through is if a cloud provisioner, if a cloud user fails to deploy a VM because there is some underlying resource constraint, how do you essentially handle the handoff between the cloud user and the self-service user and the Fabric administrator? So the specifics of how it works is when we do a host ratings during the time of a VM deployment on a cloud, you will encounter a failure, but we will also log that failure so that the admin can essentially look at the corresponding failure and be able to troubleshoot the reason why the failure happened. So I'll walk you through just that. So I have a console here, which I'm a self-service user. So on this user, as you can tell, I have no Fabric tab here, so it allows me to essentially just deal with VMs and services. So I have a template for a large VM, and I'll go ahead and try to create a virtual machine. Cloud demo. Once again, I'll next through each one of these. And once I come to the placement page, it will only allow me to place on a private cloud. And on this, once again, it goes through the ratings page. And as you can see, you will see failures for each of the clouds. And on this particular one, it just tells you that the virtual machine cloud demo could not be deployed on the hardware supporting the cloud. The interesting thing is it gives you the task ID of the corresponding job it logged under the covers. So essentially, you can go copy this text, and you can cut paste it into an email and send it to your administrator and say, hey, I tried to deploy VM. Here's the failure. Go figure it out. And then when I tab over to the administrator's view, and if I look at his idea of the jobs, there we go. If you look at, I've already selected one. Unfortunately, I think it's scrolled off pretty fast. So if you look at what is logged on the administrator side, you will discover a job entry which says completed with info, and essentially tells you what the reasons for the failure are. And it says could not be placed because of the following issues. And it talks about, there's a violation in usage quota, not enough memory usable. And so especially if you're running low on your underlying Fabric that's backing up the cloud, and typically the clouds are over-provisioned, so you could run into this issue as you're approaching your thresholds. This allows you to essentially be able to coordinate the failure between the self-service user who encountered the failure and the Fabric administrator who has to debug the failure and figure out what happens. In response to this, the administrator could decide, I need to put more hosts backing this up, so essentially I have capacity with more memory to back up this self-service user, and so remediate this problem. And after they do that, they can tell the self-service user to go ahead and recreate their VMs and hopefully they will be successful at that particular time. So we get back to the PowerPoint. So that was the failed cloud placement demo. This was done especially in response to a lot of user requests where people were running into precisely this situation. And in the absence of some coordination between the self-service user and the administrator, what typically tended to happen was the self-service user would send an email. A couple of hours later, the administrator would try to look at it. Whatever the situation was could potentially have disappeared by then because maybe there was a peak load when the self-service user was trying to create a VM, and now it's no longer the case. So they'd just go, okay, try it again. And there'd be another back and forth. And so you could not pinpoint what the failure points were. And this particular feature was put in purely to alleviate that particular workflow that customers encountered. Too many. So just a review of all the things that we talked about in this particular session. We talked about library object equivalency, which was done purely in response to the need for you to stage your library artifacts in multiple areas for faster deployment, also to be able to essentially deal for one or more of your library resources being down for some reason. We talked about the leveraging of service templates and use of the import-export functionality to be able to not only back up your service templates, but also mirror them in additional VMM installations. We talked about the improvements we've made in the System Center Operations Manager integration. I walked you through fairly quickly the fine-tuning of dynamic optimization through the setting of thresholds and being able to set the aggressiveness with which you do dynamic optimization. We talked about how you can tie this with power optimization, so you can turn your hosts off in response to decrease in load and have them automatically be turned back on when the load rises again. We talked about custom placement rules so that you can essentially inject your own desired placement behavior into how VMs are placed as it stands. As always, please enter your evaluation for the end of the session, and there will be fabulous prizes if you do so. There you go, access to the digital information. So if there are any questions, we'd like to take them at this point. Yeah, sure. Actually, there's one thing I did not, Stephen reminded me that I failed to show you, so I could show you. So one of the nice things that if you have set up DO, so if you look at this particular cluster, you will see that my first host is only one VM. There's a whole bunch of VMs on my second host. Come on. Oh, sorry. Here we go. There are none. There's a whole bunch of this. There's one. And it's obviously unbalanced. And I previously have turned my optimization to, I've turned off my auto optimization. But if you go to optimize host, it gives you a very nice report. And it tells you which VMs are going to be moved and to what host they're going to move to. And you can hit optimize, and it will cause the migration of these to happen. So you can even examine your report or the effect of your dynamic optimization before you run it. Of course, if you feel confident with dynamic optimization after using it for a while, you can turn it on to auto, and this is what it will do automatically. Question? Oh, the kind of rules for affinity and anti-affinity, where certain VMs need to be together and certain VMs cannot be together because one host going down should not take down all of your domain controllers, for example. So today, the features in VMM don't explicitly allow you to do that. So you can, if you want, you can try to write custom rules in order to be able to enable that particular affinity or anti-affinity. But we're working on that for future versions to do exactly what you're suggesting there. Yes?
When you're doing the power conservation, I assume that might shut the system down, the loss of that system in maintenance mode stop so that you're not getting alerts.
Yes. And there's a power savings report. If you watched all the reports that were there, there's a power savings report there too. And so you can run that power savings report to figure out how much this functionality triggered, and potentially, if you have the right information, how much power you saved as a consequence. Yes?
Are there any news in VMM 12 in managing difference in disks?
In
Machines that use difference in disks.
in what way do you mean manage?
Training environments, we use a lot of difference in disks to manage a large set of machines with lower the disk loads. But when you manage a machine that has a difference in disk in earlier versions, they just broke away and tried to do something like export them and put them in a library and things like that.
So I'm not sure we have specific views or specific things that essentially show you the hierarchy or the dependency chain of differencing disks. I don't believe we have anything that's explicit to that. No, I don't believe we have made a lot of changes to the way differencing disks work. So you will see that behave largely like 2008 R2 works. One of the challenges with differencing disks is, it's easy to kind of do it for the first time, but as you migrate VMs, you really want the differencing disk to be the only artifact that migrates. So it requires you to keep track of where all your base disks are and how distributed they are. And so we have started making some steps towards stating equivalency between disks with the family and the release. And we expect in future versions to be able to do the full cycle behavior of differencing disks captured in VMM. But right now, we have not made any changes to that in 2012. Thought I saw another hand. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much for your time.